Good morning everyone, hope you're all having a wonderful day today. Before we get started in the video, if you'd like to help out the channel in any way, you can like, share, and subscribe because of course that stuff is free and it really does help out the channel. On top of that, if you look at the links in the description, I also own my own company. We make AR-15 steel targets and they're all on sale for the entire month of November. So if that sounds like something that you're interested in, go ahead and check the first link in the description. Other than that, there's subscribe star and there's a few other things down there if you are interested, but let's go ahead and get into the video. So first off, to the YouTube censor watching this video, we are talking about a unmodified upper receiver, which again is not a firearm in any way, shape, or form, and this video is strictly for informational purposes, and so we will be chatting about some of its features. So with that out of the way, we are of course talking about the Wolf A1 upper receiver. This one here is specifically the 12.5-inch version. Now, I made a video a few months ago on the 14.5-inch version, more of a first shots video. I threw it in a bunch of water, did a bunch of fun testing with it, and that was kind of more of a first shots video. But since then, I put a lot of rounds through both the 14.5, which I eventually sold. I had a 16-inch for a little while, which I liked as well, and now my final version, which is the 12.5-inch version. And you guys have actually seen this upper receiver in a lot of other videos. At this point, I think it's been featured in 3 or 4 other videos with red dot sights, different LPVOs, and just a bunch of different stuff that we've been testing on while shooting this upper receiver. So at this point, in terms of round count, we're somewhere north of 1,000 rounds, maybe between 1,000 and 1,200 rounds. I'm not exactly sure, but it has been through quite a bit in a lot of different setups on top of my other experience with the other Wolf upper receivers. The main difference that sets this upper receiver apart from some of your other contemporary AR-15 upper receivers is the actual operating mechanism. So now most AR-15s are direct impingement or internal piston, if that's what you guys call it. This one here is a external piston. It is a short stroke piston system, short stroke tappet piston system. So it is very different, and so it recoils different and it behaves differently. So it has to have some different parts in there for, of course, that different recoil system. So first up, let's go ahead and talk about the bolt carrier group itself. Now, the bolt carrier group looks fairly standard. It looks almost identical to any other AR-15, M4 sort of bolt carrier group, and this one here is, of course, full auto cut. But the main difference is that, well, first off, there are no gas keys, so this thing kind of, the bolt itself just moves back and forward with no resistance because, of course, on the inside there is no gas rings because there's no gas going through the bolt carrier group. On top of that, you have no gas ports in the side of your bolt carrier that would allow that gas to escape your bolt carrier group, which allows it to have a more soft recoil impulse, of course. So as it's recoiling, it's dumping a lot of that gas because it doesn't need it as long as your gas rings are still working properly. On top of that, what looks like a gas key that is cut short is actually our strike face for the piston system. So of course, when the piston system starts moving backwards, it hits this strike face right here, which then of course starts the bolt unlocking and moving rearward. So instead of having gas on metal, you have metal on metal, so a metal piston slamming into the strike face, which then of course starts the bolt moving backwards. Now, there are some pros and cons to that. In terms of everything else though, the bolt looks, it is pretty much identical to a regular AR-15 bolt. I don't think you can use a regular AR-15 bolt unless it doesn't have gas rings in there, though of course don't quote me on that. But it uses the same firing pin, it actually uses a high quality firing pin retainer. It's actually a machined piece instead of just like your cotter pins, which I really dislike, so it is actually a nice upgrade. Now the finish on the bolt carrier group, it does look a little different. It almost looks a little green, if you guys can see that. And the reason for that is because it's more of a phosphate finish, so it has a little more grit to it. It doesn't feel very smooth like a nitrated bolt would. That being said, the finish has held up really well, and a part of that is because of course it is a piston system, so it does not heat up the same way as a DI system would, where it has hot gases flowing through the bolt carrier group. You're really not going to get the same amount of heat building up in your bolt carrier group, so it's actually going to last a little bit longer. Something else I didn't mention is that this strike face is actually welded in place, so I don't believe it's one piece. It is actually welded in place, so but there's no staking or anything like that. So if there was like a screw trying to hold it in place, more than likely after a certain amount of time that screw would just shear off. So having it welded in place, which is a very substantial welding job that they did on it, is of course the most permanent solution, so that you never have to worry about that coming off, which is actually a weak point on most AR-15s, which is why almost everyone mentions how well or how bad staked gas key is on a normal AR-15. Something else to mention about this before we move on is that I have not cleaned it whatsoever in well over 1,000 rounds, and on the front area, of course, where it enters and exits the chamber on the actual bolt itself, it's very dirty and has a lot of buildup on it. But the rest of the bolt carrier group, because again, there's no gases going through the upper receiver really all that much, there's a little bit, but not much. The rest of the bolt carrier group is very, very clean. So I basically lubricate it every now and again whenever I think about it, and I don't really clean it because it honestly doesn't need it. You don't have gas rings. It's a much more simple system, a little bit more violent system, but it's a little more simple, and there's just fewer things that can go wrong. And of course, there's less heat, and heat generally will cause damage and wear over time. So generally speaking, a piston system can extend the life of both your bolt and your bolt carrier, which is nice. Now moving on to the actual upper receiver itself, as you'll notice, it is a slab side upper receiver, and on top of that, there is no brass deflector. So whether you're shooting steel or brass case ammunition, it comes back at about 430. So it is a very aggressive, so if you have anyone behind you, directly behind you, you can get hit with brass. So, and on top of that, if you're a lefty trying to shoot through from your left shoulder, you're gonna get brass right into the chest or the face most of the time. Now, most people agree that the forward assist 99.9% of the time is useless and you don't really need it. However, most people like it, and I also like to have it on most of my guns because it doesn't really cause any damage, so I do like to have it. But in a piston system, it's even less necessary because, of course, as I mentioned, there are no gases flowing through your bolt carrier group, and there's less buildup in your bolt carrier group, so you're less likely to need it overall. Still nice to have, and I actually would like a brass deflector. I think that would be one quality of life improvement. But other than that, a fairly standard upper receiver, standard MIL-SPEC dust cover. One other minor difference is that the upper receiver is actually slightly taller than a standard MIL-SPEC AR-15 upper receiver. It's probably taller by maybe 0.1, 0.2 inches, somewhere in that regard. So what that means is if you have a 1.5 mount or a 1.75 mount, it's going to actually be a little bit taller than that. So your height of a bore is going to be slightly different on this upper receiver because it is just a little bit more tall. And if I didn't mention it already, the charging handle is just basic MIL-SPEC. Any AR-15 charging handle will work. Now, moving forward from that, we have the one thing that, in my opinion, really drags down the overall system. So we have a Polymer handguard that's about 9.5 inches long, but you don't have any way to actually mount something directly to the handguard. On the bottom, what is nice is you do have this really nice ribbing on the bottom, so you don't need an angled foregrip or something like that to give you extra grip. There is a lot of grip built into the handguard itself. Now, there are ways to attach things to the upper receiver or to the front handguard, but that requires another special attachment that mounts onto these two top screws and then kind of folds around like a shield almost. That will give you some Picatinny or some M-lock slots, I believe. I think there's a couple different versions of it, but that is like $100 by itself. Now, there is actually a rail system that's either Keymod M-lock, I think they also have a Picatinny version of it, that fits into the normal slot because actually there's a pin that you push out and then the whole handguard will come off top and bottom, so it's a two-piece design, kind of like a old style M4 or M16 style handguard, but not quite, and it's more secure actually because it is a pin, so it's actually rock solid in there. There's almost no movement whatsoever. Still wouldn't trust like a laser zero on it or anything, but it is better than like the old style handguards that'll just move back and forward on you. But back to the modern style handguards, if you can find one for any of the versions that are out there, they're anywhere from $200 to $300, which takes this from a decently priced upper receiver at about $500 to $600, depending on where you get it, to a very expensive upper receiver without anything else on it, and you have to do some modifications, and that puts you in some territory where you may not want to be in, competing with things like BCM and some other really reputable manufacturers. So I think that the handguard, not my favorite. It does work, and of course if you don't plan on mounting anything forward, including a light, because there is no way to mount anything directly to the rail without buying something else that's either $100 or $200 or $300 depending on what route you go with. So in my opinion, that's a pretty big miss. And that is one thing I would change. I would make it come stock with a good handguard and just up the price a little bit. Now let's go ahead and talk about the barrel, which the barrel, in my opinion, was one of the main reasons that I was excited about it. For instance, I like the fact that it's a piston upper receiver. Again, we haven't even gotten into the piston system yet, but I like the fact that it came in 12.5, 14.5, which are some of the best most sought after barrel lengths right now, especially in AR-15s. Everybody wants a mid profile or a mid-length barrel. You know, they're not looking for a 16-inch because that's lame. It's a rifle, you know, whatever. And they don't want something that's a 10.5 because of course that's no longer cool. So everybody's looking for the 11.5, 12.5, 13.7, or whatever else happens to be out there. But I do personally like the 12.5. It is a really good mix of velocity while still being very, very compact. On top of that, the barrel is extremely high quality. What we have here is a hammer forged barrel, 1-in-7 twist. It is chambered in 5.56, and it's not free floated, of course, because of the handguard that is pinned in place on the actual gas block, which is again pinned to the barrel. We'll get into that in just a minute. But it is a very, very good profile. So it's not a pencil barrel. It's about a step above a pencil barrel, and it does not do any weird things that it does not need to. For instance, a lot of like M4 profiles or government profiles, they'll make the end really fat, or they'll have different cuts in it for mounting like a grenade launcher on it, which mess with barrel harmonics, and they also look really bad. So in this case, you have a straight tapered, and then you have a neck up to your gas block, which I believe is a 750, but again, you can't just switch it out to a different gas block. And then you have a, again, straight taper, so it's the exact same taper at the end of the barrel. Now, if you buy the 14.5 or the 16-inch upper receiver, you actually have about a 20% larger profile after the gas block, but with the 12.5, you don't really need it for the rigidity because it is a shorter barrel. So it is the exact same profile at the end of the barrel as it is in the early part of the barrel, which means that it is very, very well balanced. So it's not top heavy at all or front end heavy, and it just balances really well. It's very, very fast. It's very quick to point. And on top of that, fairly accurate. I'll show you a picture. It's a 5-round group of 77 grain IMI, their razor core ammunition. Not my favorite ammunition, but I am very limited on my match ammunition right now. And actually even that ammunition was sent out to me by a very kind subscriber who gave me a good deal on it, so I picked up a bunch from him. But it performed fairly well, especially for a non-free floated barrel. For instance, I've done some testing with it with Wolf ammunition. At 50 yards, I was able to get about 1.5-inch group. So again, that's about 3 MOA with Wolf, which is, in my opinion, perfectly fine. You know, some really good barrels will shoot at 2, and some bad barrels will shoot at 5 to 6. But with the 77 grain razor core ammunition, I was able to get a 1.5-inch group, an 1.5-inch 6-shot group, because of course I can't count. So at 100 yards, I was able to get about 1.5 MOA out of it for, again, a non-free floated barrel and a fairly lightweight profile at that with 77 grain razor core, which again, it's not my favorite ammunition, but it does the job absolutely. A couple more things on the barrel. The gas block is of course pinned, which is great because not all barrels need to be pinned with a gas block. Of course, DI, there's a lot of military DI guns that are not pinned, but when you have a piston, which is an actual piece of metal slamming back and forth, it is a very, very good idea to have that pinned to your barrel so it will not move. So it is pinned, so that gas block is 100% secure. On top of that, the gas block also doubles as your front sight base, which is adjustable just like any other A2 front sight base would be. It is an 1.5-inch height, which again is fine. So if you have your rear iron sight down, then you have your optic mounted, and you're pretty much good to go, because of course you can't mount anything on your rail itself, so it is nice to have that integrated front gas block or front sight post in your gas block. The problem with it is that after about 50 or 60 rounds, it gets extremely hot, so don't touch it. Now moving forward from there, the 12.5s can come with a couple different muzzle devices, just depends on what they come in with. So in this case it has the long A2 style flash hider, but some of them come in with short A2 style flash hiders. It kind of just depends. If you do have a 14.5 and it comes in with the long version, it will actually be able to let you pin and weld the 16 inches. So if you buy a 14.5, you want to run it as a rifle, pin and weld with the muzzle brake or the muzzle device that it comes with, and you're good to go. Now let's go ahead and talk about the piston system itself. So I should mention that the actual gas length is about carbine plus an inch or so. So it's not quite a mid-length, and it's a little bit longer than a carbine, which again on a 12.5-inch barrel I will take all day long. So after you've twisted the knob on the side, you simply rotate your piston system, and it's kind of gunked up right now because, as I mentioned, I don't really clean it. And after that, you can just pull it straight out. So right here is your entire piston assembly, and it comes out as one piece, which means that if you need to do field maintenance, if you need to do cleaning on it, it's not complex. It's very, very easy to put back in and remove. If it gets damaged and you have a spare piston system, it's just as easy as removing, slide back in, and you're ready to get shooting again. So to get this out of the way, I'm not a gunsmith or an armor, and I'm not also a small arms expert. There's a very good channel, Small Arms Solutions, who did an excellent breakdown of the piston system on this. But suffice to say that despite the fact that it's very simple, easy to clean, easy to remove, all that sort of stuff, it's actually a very complex system that it looks to be based off of a Colt prototype-ish system. So, if I can get that other spring to come out, there we go. So what we have here is a dual recoil spring and of course a head. This is your tappet system right here at the front that can actually rotate about 10-15 degrees in each direction, and that allows it to create the best seal possible, allowing you to get the correct amount of gas every single time. Now, talking about the dual recoil impulse, or not the dual recoil impulse, the dual spring system on here, what that means is that when it gets to start bottoming out and then you get that second spring engaged, which is of course much stronger, you get a much softer return. So it's hard to catch on tape, but one of the things that I really like about the Wolf A1, all of the guns that I've shot, is that even for a piston upper receiver, which is slightly more violent than a DI, they return to zero incredibly well. If you pull the trigger, there's a slight snap, a slight jerking motion, and it goes right back to exactly where you had it before, which means that you can shoot it very quickly up close. Part of that, I believe, is to the sort of dual recoil impulse that short stroke piston systems have. So you have two reciprocating masses. You have your bolt carrier group slamming back and forth, and you have your piston system slamming back and forth. Now, the piston system does not move as far as your bolt carrier group. I mean, it's probably moving maybe 2 to 3 inches at its maximum, and then it slams back forward. So you do have a lot more moving mass, but it's not all moving together. Now, in AK, a long stroke piston system, you do have a huge piece of metal essentially reciprocating back and forth. With a piston system or a short stroke piston system, what you have is you have the piston system acting, hitting the bolt carrier group, starting that, and then by the time the bolt carrier group bottoms out, what you have is you have the piston system returning. So you have two motions slamming forward and backwards at the same time, which seems to mitigate some of the recoil, so you get that quick snap because it's very instantaneous. It has a much faster recoil cycle than a DI gun, because of course as soon as the gas hits the front of the gas block, that is when your recoil cycle starts, versus when the gas reaches your bolt carrier group, which is of course it has to go twice the distance to reach your bolt carrier group than it does just to reach the gas block itself. Basically what I'm trying to get at is that even though the recoil impulse is a little sharper and a little quicker, I can run this gun just as fast as any extremely well-gassed DI gun because of that interesting recoil impulse. So it's quick, but it also returns right back down to zero because of course you have that piston kind of acting like a dual recoil almost, so it recoils forward and then back at the same time as your bolt carrier group is bottoming out, and so it kind of negates its own recoil even though it is sharper. Now there are a lot of people who can explain what I just said a lot better, but I hope to give you guys kind of an idea of what it's like to actually shoot one of these upper receivers from someone who's owned all three of them and has shot them all quite a bit. So one of the downsides of a piston system, we're just going to mention this really quickly, is that you need to run a heavier buffer. For this gun, they actually do make a specific heavy buffer. I think it's like 5 ounces, 5.5 ounces or so. I was generally running an H2 buffer, and in fact, there were a couple times where I had some cases shear off in the chamber because, of course, with a piston system, as I mentioned, it is extracting extremely quickly because it opens up very fast. As soon as the gas hits the piston in the front, the bolt carrier starts to move to the rear and unlock. Instead of waiting for the gas to actually hit the bolt carrier group and to start flowing through it, you have a much more immediate recoil impulse. So you need to slow down that bolt, and the way to do that is to either have really strong springs or a heavier buffer, or preferably both. So if you buy this upper receiver and you put it on your standard MIL-SPEC lower receiver with just a carbine buffer and your rack grade spring, and you're getting weird extraction issues where it's shearing off part of the case in the chamber and it's not fully extracting it, it's because the bolt is moving too quickly and you're overriding the spring pressure on the extractor or on the actual strength of the edge of the case itself. So the only issue I ever had with this was when I was accidentally running it with a weaker spring or a weaker or a lighter buffer. But if you're running an H2, in any of my other upper receivers, I had not had any issues with them whatsoever. Now, an interesting thing about these upper receivers is there is, generally speaking, more demand than there is supply. So I was very lucky when I saw this come in stock. I picked one up immediately. I believe I got it from Classic Firearms, and I believe out the door it was right at $500. That being said, if you buy them from someone who still has one, they might be $600, $700 for just the 12.5 upper receiver, because I believe the 12.5 is currently the most popular. For the money that I paid for it, which again is about $500, it is absolutely worth it for a range upper receiver, for a target gun, for a practice gun. If you just want something that's really cool and different from pretty much every other upper receiver on the market, and you don't want to pay PWS prices of like $1,000 to $1,200 for an upper receiver, this will definitely scratch that itch. But with the caveat to that, if you want something for home defense or for a serious gun, well, I would say that the build quality and the durability, the reliability is absolutely there for this upper receiver. For me, because I have to buy expensive accessories to mount my lights, my lasers, anything else that I want to mount to it, it kind of kills it for me for home defense or for a serious duty gun. And the main reason for that is if you take a $600 upper receiver like this, if I was to go out and try and find it today, and I wanted to then buy one of the really nice rails for it in either M-LOK or Keymod or something like that, then I'm looking at a $900 upper receiver, and $900 for just the upper receiver, no accessories, nothing. And so when you get to that $900 price tag, now you're competing with a lot of really nice high-end AR-15 upper receivers that you have, of course, a lot more aftermarket accessories for, and you don't have to go out of your way and spend extra money and wait for parts to show up if they're in stock, if you can find them. So for home defense or duty right now, unless you're willing to just spend a lot more money on it to get it to that point where you can mount everything that you want, for me it's a no, because I don't want to spend nearly double what the upper receiver is worth to get it to the point that I want when I could just go out and buy something nicer. But for a target gun, for a practice gun, for more of a novelty, or if you're a collector, or if you just really like the look of it and you really want the T91, because of course this is the military version T91, or the T91 clone, essentially very, very similar to what they have there. You can absolutely do that, and for $500 to $600, absolutely worth it in my opinion, because it is an excellent upper receiver, very, very reliable, very accurate for a non-free floated upper receiver, and it just continues to work and work. And of course, if you're tired of just your run-of-the-mill AR-15 upper receivers, this will scratch your itch. So that's pretty much it for the video, guys. Like I mentioned in the beginning, if you want to help out the channel in any way, check out any of those links in the description. All that sort of stuff helps me out a lot. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please leave them down below. Thank you guys once again for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.